Hello, and welcome back to PolyToots. This is the Halloween episode, which is a little bit late, but pretty good. I'm also not scripting this video, so at least if I can't make it spooky for you, then it should at least be riddled with anxiety for me. So yeah, you're probably going to hear some odd sounds, all of the mouse clicks and whatever else, but it's a pretty simple shader, just melting some stuff down, and yeah, it gets a little bit glitchy depending on the types of meshes you use, which is why I have these different examples. And as always, do have the Shadergraph version as well as the Amplify version, but because the last tutorial we did Shadergraph, this one is going to be made with the Amplify shader. So everything here will be freely available to download over on Patreon. So let's go ahead and get started here. We're going to be creating a Amplify shader, and let's go with Amplify shader, universal, not experimental. Just go with a standard PBR shader for now, and give this a name. Okay, so let's dock this here, and one thing that I've never mentioned in a tutorial before, but if you have a window that's docked and you have it selected, if you do shift and space, it will full screen, so it's pretty handy. It won't work if the window isn't docked, so if you have it just out and about, that won't work, so it has to be docked. Yeah. And we're going to leave everything basically as default. The important stuff here is all in the nodes, and we'll get the base albedo out of the way first. It's just some basic rim lighting with two colors. So let's go get our two colors, and then we'll get down a Fresnel. And the Fresnel is basically, a rim light. It's going to add this sort of white mask around the edges of your mesh, depending on your view direction. And we can use a lerp to determine what color is the white bit and what color is the black bit. And it's, it's really that simple. And we'll also put in some extra floats here, which are going to be properties. And these are going to be plugged into the scale and the power, which I've always thought was strange naming, because I mean, sure, it's correct, but the power in this instance is actually more what we would call, like the size of the rim lighting. And then the scale is more like the strength of it or the power of it. So yeah, I like to name them the other way around. And at the moment, I've just given them default values of what they were before. We can always tweak this later because they are properties, just double checking. So yeah, we're going to plug the Fresnel into the alpha slot of the lerp. So that's what we're using as the mask, and we can determine what goes into A and B. So this, for example, would be, let's say, our base color. And then this one's going to be the rim color. And if I start changing these, you should be able to see. So, blue is going to be on the outside with the rim lighting. Green for the base color, or the black part. What I want just for now is, kind of like a dark green and then like a lighter green. So we can just, for now, copy paste that and boost those values a bit. We can always tweak it on the shader, because I think, no, properties. Now the properties. So that can go into our albedo, and that's basically the whole thing for albedo. We'll just quickly save this and then come out. We'll just right click on our shader and we'll create a material from it. And let's just stick this on everything. So yeah, at the moment, the rim's probably okay. Maybe base needs to come down a bit. Yeah, maybe something like that for now. We can always change this later. Let's get onto the more important part. If you remember, we were having our mesh basically sliced down the middle, and a lot of people do this with alpha. If you've seen any of those tutorials for the the liquid in a bottle, they almost always use alpha, but there's no need. We can just actually manipulate the mesh in that same way. So what we'll start with is a vertex position node. This basically defines, the pivot point of our object. And we're just going to subtract that with just a random float for now. And I'll put the default at 1. We do only want to subtract on the Y though, because that's the, the up and down axis. And if we just go and plug this straight into the vertex offset now, you'll see what's happening, and it's, it's not going to be correct, but it's gone a bit weird. And also, if we're moving the, oh, this isn't a property. Okay, yeah, so now if we change the melting value, it's just, it's moving the whole mesh in like a weird way as well. So there's two things we need to do. One, we need to specify that when, the melting point is at a certain height, we can still see the mesh underneath. And, so it's not being squished down from both sides, basically. And the other thing is we obviously need it to not go off center, it should go up and down in a straight line, not so much at an angle. So the two things we need to introduce are just a minimum value and an append. So we'll get the minimum, and we don't actually need to introduce a float here at all. We can just keep this as 0 because that is where we want the minimum to be. It's going to be the bottom of an object basically. And then we can drop down and append, and we'll hook that min into the y, and we'll output only to a vector 2 because that's as low as we can go, but that's all we need. And that will go into the vertex offset instead. So this should force the up and down melting, and this min node here should be the thing that keeps the mesh whole as we are melting it down. So yeah, as you can see here, that seems to be doing its job. And you may notice that they don't melt at the same time, because this is all based on the scale of your object. Not so much the scale here, you know, if everything is at 1, 1, 1, this is like a meter sphere. This is like a 2 meter dude, and this is somewhere in between. So, you know, if I start to come down under 2 meters here, you know, I'm at 1.85, it's chopping through this guy. And then as we get lower, it starts to chop everything else. Now, it's not world space. You know, if I move this up and down, he doesn't get sliced. But it is very much based on, you know, how large your object is. It's also worth mentioning that in this context, 0 is actually the pivot point of the object because we're using vertex position. So if you had a default sphere in this scene, one thing I should mention, my sphere is unique, being a little bit cheeky there. And we chuck on this shader, you can see that 0 for this default sphere is actually only halfway because that's where the pivot point of the object is. So if you wanted to fully melt a default sphere or an object that has the pivot in the center, you would actually need to go even further down. In this case, minus 0.5 because it's a meter sphere and the pivot is in the middle. Maths checks out. So anyway, we have that, and the next thing we want to do is introduce some gloopiness. Oh, actually, while I'm here, and this is just ridiculous of me, I should have mentioned this sooner. If you own Amplify Shader Editor, you currently have access to a free sample of shaders that they just released. I think at the moment, if you don't own Amplify, you can get these with 10% off or something. Don't quote me on that. But the reason I'm mentioning this is not to promote Amplify. It's more to do with the fact that for this particular shader, I was looking at some of their examples that they include. And this is the one that they have for the melting, which is what got me thinking about whether or not we can melt something and have it, you know, expand on the bottom as it melts. You know, it's not like it's melting into thin air. Like in this example, I want it to melt down into a blob. So as with all of these examples, you know, you do have full access to the nodes that make them, but this was just like, I'm sorry to whoever made this, but this is just crazy spaghetti town. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we don't need. So yeah, it was nice to look at, but we can definitely, you know, once you understand how it all works, you can put together your own, and this is going to be proof of that because that's exactly what we're doing. So anyway, sorry about that little interjection. We'll carry on now with the wavy melting bit. So as it melts down, it's going to get, you know, like all gloopy and bubbly, I guess. So we're going to use our old friend world space UVs for this, which usually always starts with a world position node. And the reason that we're using world space UVs for this is just because, you know, you can attach this sort of noise that we will eventually add onto any object, and it will always, you know, deform in the same way. It's not based on your object's UVs. We want to append this on the X and the Z and output to a vector 2. And the reason that we want X and Z is that it's a top-down projection. So, you know, this is the X, this is the Z, and this is the axis that it makes. So it's a, you know, top-down projection. And we'll multiply this by a value that we'll just call like noise tiling or scale or something. And then we're going to grab ourselves a panning node because we do want this effect to move. So we'll just grab a panner. And then lastly, you can either use a texture here or just for the sake of the tutorial, I'm just going to use the noise generator. Let's expand this out so we can see what's going on. So if we plug this in at the moment, obviously we need some tiling. Let's go with like 1 for now. So we can see here. And if we were to do something with the speed, 1 on 1, you can see that it's, you know, it's moving, which is exactly what we want. And so for now, if we just go ahead and literally add this into this equation over here, it's going to be kind of weird, but we can get through this. Oh, is that spooky yet? Is anyone scared? So yeah, as you can see, it's doing what we're telling it, but it's a little bit crazy. Kind of nice though, I guess. So yeah, there's obviously some stuff that we need to work with. So we need to definitely like ease it off, make sure it's not so wibbly wobbly. And I think also as well, we may have an issue. No, we'll see. So we'll just do one thing at a time. Let's definitely tone down the scale of that. I'm just gonna do a multiply. I'm gonna multiply it by like, I don't know, like 0.1, 0.2 or something. For now, that should be fine. Like it's the same thing, just not as strong. Because from memory, I think there was something else I had to do, but this is why I normally script these things. It's pretty good, to be fair. It's nice. Okay, so that's going down. Okay, I think I've just remembered. If you wanted that strength of the noise to also be controlled by the melting slider, then we can add that in now. This is kind of optional, but let's quickly get through this. I'm going to turn this melt slider into a register first, so we can just use it again and again without having to get spaghetti everywhere, basically. And then we'll re-add it here with a get. That's a melt, and then over here as well I will get melt. Now our melt value, it can go pretty crazy, you know, like in our current example we have a monster that's 2 meters high, so it's gonna have like a value of like 2 to begin with, which is quite high. So initially we might just want to tone that down, like the same kind of thing that we're doing here. So we'll multiply this by 0.2, and then we also want to well, actually maybe it's optional. Let's let's do this. I am never doing unscripted again. This is a mess. Okay, melty dude melts down, and as you can see, starts off really wavy the higher the value, which makes sense. And then as we're coming down, it's starting to mellow out a bit. The only problem is once it hits, you know, 0 or thereabouts, it's basically just stopped. So what we can introduce is a maximum to basically indicate like the lowest number that this can go to, even if we go beyond that number. So I can go maximum or max in this case, and we can give this you know, whatever value we want. For example, if I were to give it, well, it'd have to be lower than 0.2, but let's go with 0.1. Yeah, so now you can see even if our melting value is pretty much almost 0, in fact even if it is 0, it's still going to have a wibbly wobbly power of 0.1, which is maybe a bit too much, so maybe we go like 0.05 or something. Yeah, so that's that. Comment these two just to tidy this stuff up. Okay, so we have the melting happening, you know, from top to bottom, and we have like the wibbly wobbliness as it's coming down, but we don't have the bit where it starts to, you know, like pool out and become, you know, like the blobby mass on the floor. At the moment, everything is just kind of shrinking down into nothing. So that's what we'll work on next. We'll grab a world normal node, and the reason for this is that we want to, like regardless of where the object is, we always want to be able to grab, you know, like the lower portion of it. So for example, if I were to just get down a multiply and stick a y in there, and we'll just get a float, and it's a value of 1, it's going to give us the top half of, you know, the sphere. We want the bottom half, not the sphere, the object, whatever it is. It's going to basically cast that across an object. But from here though, you may have noticed that we can't really control how much it goes up and down. We can really only control well, whether or not it's on the top or the bottom, or how strong it is, basically. So we're going to go -1 just because that's the direction, the normals that we want to affect. But we'll introduce a smooth step. Let's just minimize this now. So we have this as our new preview, and we can alter basically the min and the max, and we'll leave the max alone and we'll just play with the minimum. So now you can see, you know, we can even go all the way up, you know, very cool. And this is what we want to have affected by our melt slider again. So we're gonna go ahead and grab that. And for now, we'll just plug this in, and, you know, in classic teaching style, this isn't gonna be right, but we'll fix the things later on. We need it to be able to basically push out the normals of our verts. So, you know, we're going to need a vertex normal node. We'll multiply this by a vector 3. And we're doing that because I only want to affect, you know, the outward normals of these verts, not the up and down. So we're only interested in x and z. We will plug the x, y, z into that, and we're only going to affect the sides, basically. And now we can just multiply these two things together. And for now, we won't add this into the chain because, you know, let's get a nice clean look at what's actually happening with these fresh nodes. Okay, fair enough. There we go. Yeah, so as we play with the melting, we've got a couple of interesting things happening here. This is the effect that we want when we start to go from earlier than one, less than one. You can see it starts to spread out. Now, of course, if we were to just add this into the chain, you know, it's going to come down and also loop out, which is kind of fine, but we can't go above 1 because then it just goes into whatever the hell this is. So yeah, we need to do some stuff for sure. We need to stop it from being so weird, basically. In fact, now is a good time to add these two together because we've at least seen what it does. It's pretty much as you would expect. It's kind of weird, and the reason it's weird is because we need to remap some of these values here. Like, we're plugging in the melt slider by default, and if we just take that out and we start to mess with some values, you can see what happens. You know, it's the same thing. Once we go above the maximum, it just will blink around and it becomes full. And so one way to stop this is to remap the value here. So we're still going to use this value on the material. You know, it will still have the numbers that we change on it, but for where we plug it into this smooth step, we're going to give it some different values basically. And we can go with, you know, let's go with like minus 0.5 to 0.5. Actually, the max, it might not matter, but either way. And all this means is we're telling this value, which is 0 to 1, to represent some other value when it goes into here. And that's really all that's happening there. And we can go and take a look at that. This needs to go back into the minus values. I've done that the wrong way around. So minus 0.5 to minus something greater than 0.5, basically. So we're no longer getting the pop, you know. It is obviously, as we increase the value, it is expanding our objects out, which is not the best, but we've lost that pop. So now it is mostly correct. And if you remember, we were using the maximum down here to essentially say, you know, when we're at a value of 0, you can still have some wibble wobble. You know, you can go down to that number. In fact, should that have been a minimum? I don't know. It works. It's fine. So yeah, we're going to use that same logic for this, in that we only want the push out to affect the mesh in a, you know, an outward value as it's melting. We don't want it to continue to expand out when it isn't melted. Don't know if that makes sense. So we can give ourselves, say, another remap. And from here, we'll go with a, let's try 2.5 is maybe the number that we wanted to increase by, and 0 is the max new. And it's kind of like the opposite way, so that when our melting has not begun, it's going to have a starting value of 0, meaning it won't push the mesh out. And then as we increase our melt, it will push it out to the value that I'm specifying here, which is, you know, 2.5, which is going to be multiplied by these values here. So it can get a little bit confusing. And let's grab ourselves another max. And we'll just make sure it is, you know, 0. So it's not going to go below 0, because even though the remap, you know, we put the new value, which, you know, previous was 1 and the new one is 0. This is just a value. It's not a slider. So we can go beyond or, you know, below 1. So the max new will update accordingly, whereas we want to force it to actually stay at 0. And let's multiply these two together and stick that in there. And yeah, so unless I've done something wrong, which is highly likely, this should be fine. Okay, it's already looking pretty good. Our melting point at the moment is, you know, 2.5. We can scale this up. The mesh is no longer extruding outward. It will only, hopefully, start to extrude outward. Yeah, there we go, as we melt down. So there we are. And it is, you know, it is going to be a little bit glitchy depending on the types of mesh that you use. In hindsight, I probably shouldn't have used this guy. Oh, I just realized I forgot the normal map. Oh man, I did all of that hard 20-minute work in Blender and I forgot the normal map. Okay, let's go and grab that. I mean, at this point, I wouldn't even be surprised if I'm recording without the sound on. That would just be the icing on the cake, really. Okay, that dude's back. And yeah, I don't like this Fresnel. It's a little too strong. Okay, I think that pretty much wraps it up. Let's just do a little bit of tidy up over here. just before we pop off. I'd like to finish this before my tea gets cold. Ah, too late. The Shadergraph version is not quite a one-to-one port, and it's one of the reasons that unfortunately I missed the Halloween date to post this. If I just stick this Shadergraph version on the sphere here, the issue I have with this one is it depends on the object's pivot. So on these examples, if your pivot is at the bottom of the mesh, it's going to be fine. But if we get in, let's say, 2 spheres. So these are both default Unity spheres. So I'll stick the Amplify one on the left and the Shadergraph one on the right. So if we come down with the melting, we can see it's quite a strong push value actually. I'll have fun with that. Yeah, you know, it does this and it goes down in a straight line. But the weird thing about the Shadergraph one is once it reaches beneath the point of an object's pivot, or rather once it goes beyond 0, it starts to offset the mesh. So yeah, I felt like I had to include that just for anyone who's, you know, hoping to use the Shadergraph version. All of the nodes are here, of course, you know, the entire shader here. It is, to the best of my knowledge, you know, as close as a port as I can get, but for some reason there's something going on in the background. But I imagine that that's because in Shadergraph, the way that we get all of this working anyway is we have to add a position node onto the end, which obviously then we're subtracting, and it probably is then offsetting the position itself. But if we get rid of this, then the whole thing doesn't work. So, you know, I would rather give you something slightly broken than not at all. But yeah, again, if anyone can fix that, that would be sweet. But aside from that, I think there is nothing left to mention, except again that all assets, including this amazing 20-minute Blender sculpt, are available freely for download. Feel free to, you know, check it out. Let me know if you have any issues. And yeah, I mean, mostly thank you for watching, and thank you for bearing through this unscripted video. Maybe I will do more of this, but probably not. It's a bit messy, a bit all over the place. I wonder how long it's been. So yeah, anyway, even though this stuff is freely available over on my Patreon, I do thank each and every one of you that chooses to help support the channel. It's amazing. Like, it's really cool. Yeah, I'm sorry that I can't post more often. Maybe if I quit my job, then I could do this every day, but we'll just see how it goes. So yeah, thank you very much, and I will see you in the next one. Wait, did I even hit record?